I've been trying to figure out how to write this down for about 3 weeks now. Started twice, deleted it both times. Not because I'm afraid of how it sounds, I mean. I am. But that's not the main thing. It's more that I keep second-guessing the order of events. Memory does that. You live through something and the sequence feels airtight, and then you sit down to explain it to someone, and you realize you've been mentally editing the whole time, smoothing things over, making it more coherent than it actually was. So I'm going to try to be honest about where I'm uncertain. I'll tell you what I saw versus what I concluded. I'll try not to make it neater than it was. My name isn't relevant. What is relevant is that for 14 months, I worked as the overnight operator at Hayward Reservoir and its associated control infrastructure, which in practical terms means I was the person responsible for monitoring water levels, managing gate operations, running equipment checks, and being the first human response if anything started trending toward an emergency condition. The reservoir sits about 40 minutes northeast of a small city you've never heard of, fed by 2 tributaries that drain a significant watershed. The dam itself, Hayward Dam, though nobody called it that, we just called it the structure, is an earthen embankment dam with a concrete spillway and a gated outlet works. Not a huge installation. Not the kind of thing that makes the news on a normal day. I took the job because the pay was better than anything else I could find with my background, and because I needed the distance. That second part is harder to explain quickly, so I'll give you the short version. My daughter Nora was 8 when her mother and I separated. The separation wasn't dramatic, no affair, no specific incident. It was just 2 people who had stopped recognizing each other and agreed to stop pretending otherwise. Nora stayed with her mother in the city. I stayed in the same apartment for 6 months after, going through the motions, and then a recruiter for the Regional Water Authority sent me a posting for the overnight operator position. And I thought, okay, get out. Give yourself some geography. Nora and I had a schedule. Video calls on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, her at her mother's place, me in my apartment in the nearest town to the reservoir. I'd drive the 40 minutes in, do my shift, drive back. The overnight run started at 9 p.m. and ran to 6 in the morning. 9 hours. In the dead of winter, that meant arriving in full dark and leaving in early gray light. In summer, I'd sometimes catch the sunrise on the drive back, which was genuinely one of the better things about the job. I want to be clear about what the job actually involved, because the specifics matter later. The main control room was a squat, concrete block building about 50 meters back from the spillway face. Inside, a bank of monitoring screens showing water levels, inflow and outflow rates, gate positions, and a dozen other parameters I'll spare you. There was a SCADA system, supervisory control, and data acquisition. Basically the software layer that lets you see and control equipment remotely. And a set of manual overrides for if the SCADA went down. I was responsible for logging readings every 2 hours, flagging anomalies to the on-call engineer, and physically walking the structure twice per shift to check for anything the sensors wouldn't catch. Seepage, sinkholes forming in the embankment, animals in the wrong places, that kind of thing. The physical walk was the part I actually liked. Even in winter, even in rain. You went out, you walked the crest road from one abutment to the other. You checked the instrumentation on the downstream face. You logged it, you went back inside. Maybe 25 minutes if you moved deliberately. Longer if something needed attention. I was alone out there for the entire shift. The nearest house was a farmstead about 2 miles east that I could see the lights of on clear nights. There was no cell reception at the structure itself. The valley blocked it, but the control room had a landline and a radio, and if I drove about a mile back up the access road, I could usually get a bar or two. This is all to say, I was comfortable with the isolation. I'd thought about it before taking the job and decided I could handle it. And I was right for the first several months. I liked the quiet. I liked having something concrete to monitor and log. I liked that I couldn't check my phone obsessively. I liked that when I called Nora on Tuesday nights, I was genuinely glad to hear her voice, rather than half present the way I'd been in the apartment, where everything felt like it was happening slightly behind glass. The first strange thing happened in late October, about 7 months into the job. I want to be careful here, because the first strange thing was genuinely nothing. I don't want to retroactively dress it up. I had finished my first walk of the shift probably around 11 p.m. I'd have to check the log to be exact, and I was back inside filling in the observation sheet when I heard the emergency siren start up. The emergency siren is mounted on a steel pole about 30 meters downhill from the control room, facing the valley below the dam. Its purpose is straightforward. In the event of a serious situation overtopping risk, embankment failure, loss of gate control. It's supposed to warn people in the downstream area. There's a small community about 4 miles down the valley, maybe 60 houses, and the siren is the primary alert mechanism. It's loud enough to hear for a considerable distance, and the sound is distinctive. Long, rising, then sustained. Not easy to mistake for anything else. I heard it for maybe 4 or 5 seconds. Then it stopped. I checked the SCADA screen first. Everything was normal. Levels were fine. Gate positions were correct. No alarms showing in the system. Then I checked the siren control panel, a separate unit mounted to the left of the main console, and the status indicator showed off, which meant the panel believed the siren was not running. I stood there for a moment, and then I went outside. The night was cool, overcast, smelled like wet leaves. I stood outside the control room door and listened. Nothing. Not even wind. I walked to the siren pole and stood underneath it. Looked up at the horn assembly, which was dark. No visible damage. The wiring running down the pole to the conduit box looked intact. I went back inside and wrote it up exactly the way I just described it. Siren audible for 4 to 5 seconds. Control panel showed off throughout. No SCADA alarms. No anomalous readings. No cause identified. I flagged it for the on-call engineer. The engineer, a man named Galloway, who I'd spoken to maybe a dozen times, called back about 20 minutes later. He asked me a few questions, listened, and then said what I expected him to say. He said brief, unscheduled activations were sometimes caused by voltage spikes, that the panel indicator wasn't always reliable as a secondary confirmation, and that he'd have maintenance look at it the next day. Maintenance looked at it. They didn't find anything definitive. Possible microsurge through the system was the working theory. They tested it, everything checked out, and that was the end of it. That genuinely was the end of it, for a while. October finished. November came. The trees around the reservoir went bare, and the water got gray, and the nights got longer, and the job continued in its ordinary way. I did my walks. I logged my readings. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, I drove up the access road far enough to get a signal and called Nora. Those calls were the clearest part of those months. I remember them more specifically than almost anything else from that period. The way she'd start in the middle of something. She never did preamble, never said hi and how are you. She'd just launch straight into whatever was on her mind, as if we'd been mid-conversation all along. A problem with a friend at school, a book she was reading, a question about why dragonflies could fly backward. I'd sit in the truck cab in the dark, listening to the heat ticking as it cooled, and think that I had not been this present for her when I was physically in the same city. There's something about distance and a schedule. You stop taking it for granted. The second time the siren went off was November 14th. I remember the date because I'd talked to Nora that evening at Tuesday, and she'd told me her school was doing a history project, and she'd chosen to do hers on dams. She said she picked it because of my job, and I remembered feeling something I couldn't quite name. Glad, but also something underneath that. The siren went off at 2:47 a.m. I know the time because I was mid-entry on a log sheet, and I wrote the time automatically, even as I was registering the sound. 7 seconds this time, possibly 8. Same results. SCADA normal, panel showed off, no visible cause. I called the engineer on call that night, not Galloway, a younger woman named Priya, who I'd only spoken to once before, and went through the same description. She was quieter than Galloway had been, asked me to confirm the panel reading twice. Then she said she'd have it logged and reviewed. I went out to the siren pole again. Same as before. Dark, silent, no visible damage. But this time, I stood there a little longer. The reservoir was behind me and uphill, and from that position on the dark slope, I could hear the water moving through the outlet works. That low, constant underwater sound, and I was aware of how alone I was in a way I hadn't been before. Not afraid, just aware. The thing I remember most from that night was the drive home in the morning. I was on the access road, just approaching the spot where I usually got cell signal, and I had the radio on low. And a news segment came on, local news, and they mentioned road monitoring alerts for the downstream valley area. Something about creek levels from recent rain. Standard public information. But my first thought, before I even processed what they were actually saying, was the siren, which I put down to being tired. By the third incident, I had started keeping a personal log separate from the official one. Nothing dramatic. I had a small notebook in my jacket pocket, and after each shift I was jotting down anything that seemed relevant. When the siren had sounded, for how long, what conditions were like, whether anything unusual had happened before or after. The third incident was December 3rd, 3:15 a.m. 6 seconds. But what I noticed that night, which I hadn't tracked before, was the timing relative to my position in the shift. All 3 incidents had occurred after my first walk, but before my second, roughly between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m., in that middle window. That on its own meant nothing that was most of the shift, so of course anomalies would fall in that window statistically. But it wasn't the timing that started to bother me. It was something else. After the third incident, I was sitting at the console trying to be systematic about it, and I pulled up the access log. Every time I badged in and out of the control room was recorded. It was an electronic lock, standard building security. And because I had a habit of badging out when I left for my structural walks, the log showed exactly when I'd left the building. The first siren. I had returned from my walk at 11:02 p.m. The siren sounded at 11:09 p.m. The second siren, I had returned from my walk at 2:41 a.m. The siren sounded at 2:47 a.m. The third siren, I had returned from my walk at 3:08 a.m. The siren sounded at 3:15 a.m. 7 minutes, every time. Within 1 minute, every time. The siren sounded 7 minutes after I had come back inside. I sat with that for a while. I told myself there were several explanations. Thermal effects returning to the building changed the internal temperature, and if there was some faulty thermal sensor connected to the siren circuit, that could create a delayed trigger. Or it was coincidence, and I was doing the thing humans do, where we impose pattern on noise because our brains are built for it. Or the badge timestamps were slightly off. I told myself all of these things seriously and in good faith. Then I sat there in the control room at 3 in the morning and I thought about the siren pole, about how the horn faced down valley toward the community 4 miles down the road. about what that siren was for. And I thought, what if it's not a malfunction? What if something is watching for when I go back inside? I didn't write that down, not even in my personal notebook. It felt like the kind of thought that got more real when you gave it words, and I wasn't ready for that. So I set it aside and did my second walk of the shift and logged my readings and drove home as the sky was going pale. But the thought was there. It had been put somewhere in my head that I couldn't quite reach back into. Nora called me that Friday, not our usual night. She asked her mother to call me because she'd finished the dam project and wanted to tell me her teacher had liked it. She'd included a section on emergency warning systems. She'd learned that downstream sirens were a last resort measure used when failure was already in progress or imminent. I said that was right. I said she'd done a great job. I asked her what else she'd learned. That the time between a warning and the water getting there depends on how big the dam is, she said. For small dams, it can be really fast. Like, not very long at all. That's true, I said. Is your dam small? Medium, I said. Medium small. There was a pause, and then she said she hoped I was being safe, which was a thing she said sometimes, and which I always found slightly arresting coming from an 8-year-old. Slightly arresting and slightly heartbreaking in a way that was hard to sit with. I'm always safe, I said. I drove back to the reservoir that Sunday night, clocked in at 9, did my first walk in the cold, and came back inside at 10:54 p.m. At 11:01 p.m., the siren ran for 9 seconds, 7 minutes. I had my jacket on before the sound finished. I went outside because standing inside felt worse. That's the honest reason. Not because I had a plan, not because I thought I'd catch anything. The control room had gotten very small, very fast, and the siren had just confirmed something I'd been trying to talk myself out of for a month, and I needed to be moving. The night was clear, cold enough that my breath showed. I walked to the siren pole and looked up at it the same way I had the other 3 times, knowing I'd find nothing different. And I was right. Dark horn, intact wiring, conduit box closed, padlock in place. I put my hand on the pole for no real reason and then took it away. I stood on the slope below the control room and looked down the valley. You could see maybe a quarter mile in the dark before the tree line closed things off. The road ran along the valley floor and disappeared around a long bend. No lights, no movement. Just the sound of the outlet works and, very far below, what might have been a dog barking, or might have been something else. Here is what I was actually thinking, standing there. I was thinking about the 7 minutes. I was thinking about it as a gap. A specific, repeating gap between the moment I came back inside and the moment the siren sounded. If it was a thermal trigger, the gap would drift. It would vary with outside temperature, internal building temperature, how long I'd been on the walk, how warm I was when I came back in. It would not be 7 minutes, precisely. 4 times in a row. Thermal effects are noisy. They don't run to the minute. If it was coincidence, the gap would not repeat. Not like this. I didn't know the exact probability, but I knew enough about how coincidence worked to know that 4 identical gaps at 4 in a row was not coincidence. Which left me with things I didn't want to think about. I went back inside and pulled up every archived SCADA log I had access to, going back to the beginning of my tenure. 14 months of data. The system stored readings in 15-minute intervals, plus any triggered events. I started filtering for anything in the siren subsystem. Any activation, any alarm, any diagnostic ping. What I found was that the siren had not registered a single logged activation in all 14 months. Not even the 4 times I'd heard it. The Siren control panel had a direct feed into the SCADA event log, and as far as the system was concerned, the Siren had never activated on my watch, which matched what the panel indicator had been showing me. Off. Every time. The Siren was sounding and simultaneously not sounding, according to every instrument in the building. I sat back and looked at the ceiling for a while. The practical explanations were running out. A voltage spike could fool the panel indicator once, conceivably twice. It could not fool both the indicator and the SCADA event log 4 times, consistently, while somehow also producing sound at a volume I could hear through a concrete block wall. The other thing I pulled from the archive that night was the operator log predating my tenure. My predecessor, I'd never met him. He'd left before I started. His name was on a coffee mug in the supply cabinet that nobody had gotten around to throwing out, had maintained the log with reasonable diligence, and I started going back through it. Not all of it. I started around the 18-month mark before my start date and read forward. His log entries were shorter than mine, more abbreviated. He had a style that was all notation and no description. Readings normal. Walk complete. No anomalies. That kind of thing. Economy of language. I respected it. But it made the reading fast. I found the first unusual entry about 40 minutes into searching. It was from roughly 10 months before I started. It said, Siren activation post-walk, approximately 0230. Panel nominal. No SCADA flag. Third occurrence. Reported to Galloway. I read that 3 times. Third occurrence. He'd reported it to Galloway, which meant Galloway had known about this before I ever mentioned it to him. Which meant when I'd called Galloway in October, calm, matter-of-fact Galloway with his voltage spike theory, he had already heard this exact description from the previous operator. He had not mentioned that. I kept reading. There were 2 more entries like the first one. Brief, notational, no drama, just the facts. And then, about 2 months later, the entries stopped being unusual. And then about 3 months after that, they simply stopped. His last entry was unremarkable. Readings. Normal. Walk complete. And then my entries began. The mug with his name on it was on the shelf behind me. I looked at it. His name was Pete, or at least that's what the mug said. Pete's mug hands off. The handwriting was in black marker, slightly faded. I did not know where Pete was now. I had never asked. The thing about working a job in relative isolation is that you don't think much about the person who had it before you. They're just an abstraction, a previous version of the role. You inherit their filing system and their labeled cabinet and their coffee mug, and you get on with it. I was thinking about Pete fairly concretely now. I called Galloway the next morning, not the on-call line, his direct number, which I had from a resource sheet. It was early, maybe 6:30. He picked up on the 3rd ring, sounded like he'd been awake. I told him I'd been going through the archived operator logs from the previous tenure, and I'd found entries describing the same Siren anomaly. 3 documented instances. I said I understood he'd been the engineer on record during that period, and I was wondering if he could tell me what the resolution had been. There was a pause. Those were investigated, he said. And? Inconclusive. Same conclusion we reached for your incidents. Likely intermittent fault in the circuit. He logged it as the 3rd occurrence, I said, which means it happened at least twice before that without being logged. His log goes quiet on the subject about 2 months later, and then stops entirely about 3 months after that. Why did he leave? Another pause. Longer this time. Pete took another position. Where? I don't have that in front of me. The way he said it was not defensive, not guilty. It was careful in the specific way that people are careful when they've thought about what they will and won't say on a subject. I'd talked to enough people in enough uncomfortable situations to recognize that kind of careful. Galloway, I said, has anyone else worked this site between Pete and me? There was a brief period with rotating coverage while we conducted recruitment. How long? 8, 9 months. That was a long time for rotating coverage on an overnight critical infrastructure post. I didn't say that. I'd like to put in a formal request, I said, to have the Siren circuit physically inspected, not just tested, pulled apart. He said he'd pass the request along. I don't know if he did. Nothing happened for 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks, I adjusted my behavior in ways that I told myself were reasonable precautions, and which, looking back, were the beginning of me taking the thing seriously, in a way I hadn't yet admitted to myself. I stopped going directly back into the control room after my walks. Instead, I would finish the walk, badge in, and then immediately badge back out and stand outside for a variable amount of time before going in. Sometimes 10 minutes, sometimes 3. Sometimes I'd go back in after 2 minutes and come back out again after 5. I wanted to see if the 7-minute gap was fixed to the moment I came inside, or if it was responsive, if it adjusted. The first time I did this, came back inside, waited 2 minutes, went back out, stood there for 10 minutes, then came in again. Nothing happened. The siren was silent. I logged that. Internally, in the notebook, varied re-entry behavior. No activation. Second time, same thing. No activation. I started thinking maybe the pattern had broken. Maybe whatever was causing it had stopped, or my variation had disrupted whatever mechanism was triggering it. I was careful not to feel relieved, because relief felt premature, and also because I had learned by then that the pattern didn't break so much as pause. The 5th incident happened on a night I hadn't varied anything. I'd come back inside in the ordinary way and sat down and gotten absorbed in a SCADA anomaly that turned out to be a stuck sensor on one of the level gauges, a real problem. Mundane, the kind of thing that required actual attention. And I completely forgot to time anything. The siren ran for 11 seconds, and in the moment it started, before I'd had time to think, I looked at the clock. I had come inside 22 minutes earlier. Not 7. I sat very still. 22 minutes. I'd been absorbed. I hadn't been watching the clock, and the siren had sounded at 22 minutes instead of 7. I turned this over for a long time. The only thing that had changed was that I hadn't been paying attention to the time. I'd been focused on the sensor problem, genuinely engaged, not listening for anything. And the interval had tripled. Which meant, and I was careful with this, because I didn't want to build conclusions faster than the evidence warranted. Which meant the timing was not tied to a fixed delay from my re-entry. It was tied to something else, something about my state. I started looking at it differently after that. Not a 7-minute delay. Something that sounded when I had stopped actively waiting for it. Something that waited for me to be not ready. That was the point at which I started sleeping worse. Not at the structure, I didn't sleep there, but at home, in the apartment. I'd wake at around 3 in the morning for no reason I could name, and lie there thinking about the valley, about the horn facing downward, about what that particular piece of equipment was designed to do, and for whom it was designed to do it. I want to be precise about something. When I say I was frightened, I don't mean the theatrical kind. I wasn't leaving lights on or jumping at sounds. I was going to work, and doing my job, and being functional. The fear was more like a change in how the air felt in the control room, like an atmospheric pressure thing, a constant low-level awareness that the room I was sitting in had a quality I hadn't initially noticed, and now that I'd noticed it, I couldn't stop. The Tuesday call with Nora that week was the one I held on to afterward. She'd moved on from the dam project, was now very interested in a documentary she'd watched about cave diving. She explained cave diving to me in significant detail. The way she explained it thorough, a little relentless, entirely absorbed, reminded me of myself at that age, which was a thing her mother had mentioned once, and I'd sort of dismissed, and was now finding harder to dismiss. At the end of the call, she said out of nowhere, "Do you hear the siren there?" I kept my voice even. "What siren?" "The one you told me about. The warning one." I hadn't told her about the incidents. I had mentioned, months ago, in a general description of the job, that there was an emergency siren. I had not mentioned anything about it sounding at night, or about any of what I'd been logging. "Sometimes during tests," I said. "Why?" "I just wondered if it was loud." "Pretty loud," I said. She made a sound of acknowledgement and moved on. I tried to move on with her, and mostly managed it. But when the call ended and I sat in the truck in the dark at the side of the access road, I thought about it. She'd asked about the siren, specifically of all the things she could have circled back to. Kids do that. They file things away and bring them back with no apparent logic. I know that. But I was sitting alone on a dark road at 10 o'clock at night with a notebook full of observations about an emergency siren that sounded when nobody was watching for it. And I was at the point where the coincidences were running together in a way that was hard to dismiss cleanly. I drove the rest of the way in and started my shift. My second walk that night was at 3 a.m. I'd been methodical about it. I was always methodical by then, logging the exact badge-out time, the route, what I observed, the badge-in time. I came off the downstream face and walked back up to the control room and stood outside it for a few minutes looking at the valley below. Clear night, very cold. Stars were out. The reservoir surface was visible as a dark mirror further up the slope, and the community 4 miles down was invisible in the dark, except for a few scattered yard lights. I thought about those houses, about the people in them asleep, about the fact that the siren existed specifically because something could go wrong fast enough that the only option was noise. Then I thought about something I hadn't let myself think about directly before. The siren was alerting, repeatedly, through whatever mechanism, by whatever means. It had alerted for my predecessor, and it was alerting for me. And every single instrument in the building said it was not alerting. In emergency management, there is a concept called a silent alarm. It's not meant to be mysterious. It just means an alarm that notifies monitoring personnel without alerting the people in the affected area. The idea being that you sometimes want to summon a response without causing panic. But there's an inverse, a situation where the alarm sounds in the affected area, but does not register at the monitoring station, where the people who should be notified are not, and only the people in the field hear it. I stood outside the control room door and I thought about that. The siren was sounding at the structure. It was not logging at the monitoring system. The people in the valley below could theoretically hear it if they were awake, if they had windows open, if they were listening. But no engineer was being paged, no authority was being triggered, no protocol was engaging. The signal was going out. It just wasn't going to the people it was supposed to go to. I badged inside, sat down at the console, pulled up the current readings. Everything was normal. I looked at the inflow rate from the eastern tributary. Normal. I looked at the water surface elevation. Normal. I looked at the gate positions and the seepage collection data and the piezometer readings that tracked pore water pressure in the embankment. Normal. 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 And then I looked at something I hadn't specifically looked at in a while, because it was one of those parameters that almost never changed. The survey baseline data, the monitoring points along the embankment crest, physical markers that were measured periodically to track whether the embankment was moving, settling, deforming. The last survey had been done by the engineering team 3 months ago. The next wasn't scheduled for another 3 months. But the SCADA system pulled continuous readings from electronic settlement sensors at 4 points along the crest. I'd never looked at the trend data closely. It was one of those things you glance at to confirm the number is in range and move on. I pulled up the trend graph for all 4 sensors. Set the window to 14 months my entire tenure. For the first 10 months, all 4 lines ran essentially flat. Tiny variations, expected settling, nothing outside normal parameters. Then at month 11, around the time of the first Siren incident, sensor point 3 started moving. Slowly, incrementally, within normal range still, but trending. I hadn't seen it because I'd been looking at point-in-time values rather than trend lines. And sensor point 3 was located at the center of the downstream embankment face. I looked at the trend line, and then I looked at the current value, and then I did the math on the rate of change, and I sat very still in the concrete block room while the instruments hummed around me and the sirens stayed silent, and the water behind the embankment held its level and continued, as it always did, to press against the earth that was supposed to hold it there. The rate of change wasn't catastrophic. I want to be clear about that, because I've thought about how to describe this without making it sound like I was sitting in front of an obvious emergency and doing nothing. The sensor was showing movement of roughly 2 millimeters per month. The threshold for mandatory escalation was 12 millimeters of cumulative displacement over any 90-day period. By that standard, sensor point 3 was within bounds. Uncomfortable bounds, a trend worth noting, but within bounds. The problem was the curve. Settlement data in earth and embankments isn't supposed to be linear. It's supposed to front-load. Most of the settling happens in the early years after construction, and then the curve flattens and stays flat. What I was looking at didn't flatten. It was slow, but it was consistent. And if anything, it had a very slight upward curve to it. Not flattening, accelerating. I am not a geotechnical engineer. I want to be honest about the limits of my expertise. I can read the numbers. I understand the parameters. I know what the thresholds are and why they exist. What I don't have is the deep background to look at a trend curve and know whether I'm seeing early-stage internal erosion or whether I'm seeing normal long-term adjustment that happens to look alarming to a non-specialist reading it at 3 in the morning. I flagged it. I wrote it up thoroughly and flagged it through the system for engineering review and sent a separate email to Galloway with the trend graphs attached. Then I sat there and thought about the siren. If something was wrong with the embankment, if there was a process developing inside the structure that the surface sensors were just beginning to register, then an emergency warning siren sounding intermittently at the site was not an inexplicable ghost story anomaly. It was information. It was a signal that something in the system was recognizing a condition that the formal reporting chain was not yet treating as serious. I turned that idea over carefully, because I knew it was the kind of idea that felt like a revelation in the middle of the night and fell apart under ordinary daylight. Systems don't decide things. Sensors measure within their designed parameters. A siren doesn't sound because the dam is worried, but I couldn't quite put it down. I went back out to the siren pole in the dark. 4th time I'd stood under it in 2 months. I looked at the conduit box at the base of the pole, the one that housed the wiring connection between the pole and whatever fed it, and I did something I hadn't done before. I tried the latch. It was unlocked. That surprised me. I'd assumed it was padlocked like the horn housing at the top. But the conduit box was just a standard weatherproof enclosure with a lever latch, no lock, and it opened when I lifted it. Inside was exactly what you'd expect. Wiring, a terminal block, a ground connection. But there was also a piece of electrical tape that had been used to bundle some excess cable, and on the electrical tape someone had written in black marker 2 words: check 3. The handwriting wasn't mine. It wasn't printed formally enough to be a factory label or installation marking. It was someone's handwriting, casual and slightly hurried. The way you write something you expect to be able to explain later. Check 3. Sensor. Point 3. I stood there in the cold with the conduit box open and the pen light in my hand, and I thought about Pete, about the period of rotating coverage between his tenure and mine, about the 8 or 9 months Galloway had described without further elaboration, about the fact that Galloway had, upon hearing my report of the Siren incidents, not mentioned that his previous operator had reported the exact same thing. Someone had stood here, stood in this exact spot, probably at night, probably during a shift, and opened this box and written that. And then they'd left the site, and whoever came after them rotating coverage, then me had never looked inside the box. Or had looked, and hadn't said anything. I took a photograph with my work-issued camera, we used it for structural documentation, and latched the box and went back inside. Galloway called me the following afternoon. I was at home, had been asleep for about 4 hours after the shift, and the call woke me. He'd reviewed the trend data I'd sent. The movement is within threshold, he said. I know, I noted that. My concern was the trend shape. I've had our geotech look at it. His read is that you're seeing a long-term consolidation response to wet season loading. We had above-average precip last spring. He's not concerned. He'd like to see another month of data before reassessing. If there's continued acceleration, he'd consider a field inspection. I told him about the note in the conduit box. Silence. A different kind of silence than his careful pauses. This one lasted long enough that I checked my phone to see if the call had dropped. I'm not aware of who would have written that, he said. It's not a factory marking. It's handwritten on electrical tape inside the conduit box for the Siren pole. It says, check 3. I photographed it. I can forward the image. Please do, he said. His voice was even, not alarmed. The evenness bothered me more than alarm would have. Alarm would have meant he was encountering something new, even meant he was managing something familiar. I forwarded the photograph. He acknowledged receipt. He said he'd look into the conduit box note and get back to me, and he said the geotech's recommendation stood. Another month of data. He did not get back to me about the note. I gave him a week and then called again. He said he hadn't been able to identify the origin of the marking, and that maintenance would remove it to avoid confusion. I said I thought it might be relevant to the anomaly history, and asked whether anyone had physically inspected the interior of the embankment. The drainage layers, the filter zones given the settlement trend. He said visual inspection wasn't scheduled until the next routine assessment. I said something I'd been thinking about for several days. I said that I'd like to file a formal written concern through the authority's safety reporting process, not because I was certain there was a problem, but because if I was wrong, a formal filing cost nothing, and if I was right and I hadn't filed, it would cost considerably more than nothing. He said I was within my rights to do that, and that the forms were on the authority's internal portal. There was no hostility in the conversation. That's the thing about Galloway. He was never hostile, never dismissive in any obvious way, never tried to shut me down outright. He just consistently arrived at the same position. Within threshold, under review, another month of data. He was the institutional version of a door that looked open and didn't move when you pushed it. I filed the report that afternoon. I documented the Siren incidents, the SCADA non-logging, the 7-minute pattern, the conduit box note, the settlement trend data, and my concerns about the consistency of the acceleration curve. I was specific, and I was measured, and I used the correct technical language, and I sent copies to 3 different people in the authorities' hierarchy. Within 4 days, I had 2 responses, both of which acknowledged the report and indicated it had been logged and would be reviewed in accordance with established processes. I also, separately, submitted a request for the contact information from my predecessor, not through any official channel. I put it in an email to the regional office's administrative contact. Framed as a routine question, I was trying to track down some historical operational notes about a piece of equipment. Was there a way to reach the previous operator? The administrative contact wrote back and said she'd look into it. 3 weeks passed. During those 3 weeks, the siren sounded twice more. Both times I had varied my re-entry behavior: come in, gone back out, come back in, and both times the siren waited. The first time I came back in for the second time and sat down and let my attention go genuinely elsewhere for a while, absorbed in something mundane, and the siren sounded at 19 minutes. The second time I was less successful at genuinely distracting myself, and it didn't sound at all. I had become certain by then that the interval was tied to my attention. Not my presence in the building. I could be in the building. It waited for my vigilance to lapse, for my focus to go somewhere else. Which raised a question I found deeply uncomfortable. If the siren was information, and it sounded when I stopped watching, then what was it telling me to watch? I started spending more time on the sensor data. I pulled the full piezometer history, which measured pore water pressure at several points within the embankment body. Pore pressure is one of the cleaner indicators of internal condition. If water is finding its way through a zone that should be relatively impermeable, the pore pressure in that zone starts to change. Most of the sensors showed what you'd expect for the season and the inflow conditions. One didn't. The sensor cluster nearest to monitoring point 3, same horizontal position as the settlement marker, buried about 8 meters into the embankment, had readings that over the past 3 months had been showing a slow but measurable upward trend, not outside threshold, but directionally consistent with the surface settlement data. 2 different measurement approaches, different physical quantities, same location, same trend direction. I added this to my formal report with an amendment. I framed it carefully. I did not say the dam was failing. I said that 2 independent instrument clusters at the same location were trending in the same direction over the same time period, and that this spatial correlation warranted physical inspection of that zone. The response to the amendment said my concerns had been noted and would be incorporated into the upcoming scheduled assessment. I asked when that assessment was scheduled. 4 months out. I sat in the control room in early January with that information and the pore pressure graphs in front of me, and I thought about what 4 months of continued acceleration looked like if I projected the curve forward. I was not doing sophisticated analysis, just arithmetic. If the rate continued and the slight upward curve continued, then at the 4-month mark, the cumulative settlement would still technically be within threshold. It would be close, but it would still be within the number they'd drawn on a chart and called safe. Numbers on charts don't know about curves. They know about snapshots. I called my father that week, which I hadn't done in several months. He was a retired civil engineer, structural, not geotechnical, but the overlap was real, and I described what I was looking at without telling him where or why. Just the pattern. Correlated settlement and pore pressure at the same embankment location, trending together, curve showing slight acceleration. He was quiet for a moment. What's the material at that zone? Do you know the construction specs? I did. I'd pulled the as-built documentation 2 weeks earlier. Compacted clay core with a gravel transition zone on the downstream side. Transition zone filter? Per spec. And the pore pressure is rising on the downstream side or inside the core. The sensor cluster is in the transition zone. Another quiet moment. If water is moving through the core into the transition zone faster than the filter is handling it, you'd start to see both. Settlement from loss of material, pressure from the hydraulic load. That's what I thought. Has someone looked at the toe of the dam? Downstream face, near the base? I had been looking at the downstream face every single walk for weeks. Visually, yes. Nothing I've seen. Seeps can start internal, he said. You don't see them at the surface until later. How much later? Depends on the geometry, the material, how long it's been developing. He paused. When you say trending, how long have you been tracking this? About 3 months for the settlement. The pore pressure trend is roughly the same window. He didn't say anything right away. I could hear him breathing, the way he got when he was thinking seriously about something. Have you told anyone? I've filed 2 formal reports. The engineering assessment isn't for 4 months. That's not right, he said. It wasn't angry, just flat. I know. Can you escalate past the engineering level? I'm looking into that. What I'd actually been looking into was the regulatory side. Hayward Dam was under the jurisdiction of the State Dam Safety Program, which had its own inspection authority independent of the Water Authority. I'd found the contact information, and I'd been sitting on it for 10 days, trying to decide. Contacting the regulator directly, bypassing Galloway and the authority, felt like a significant step. The kind of step that ended employment. The kind of step you had to be sure about before you took it. I wasn't sure. I had correlated trends and a pattern I couldn't explain, and a note in a conduit box, and a predecessor I couldn't locate. I did not have a crack in the face, or visual seepage, or anything a photograph would make obvious. The night I finally decided to make the call to the state program, I was doing my first walk of the shift. January. Very cold, hard frost on the crest road, and the grass on the downstream face. I had my flashlight, and I was doing the downstream face check, sweeping the slope systematically, looking at the grass, looking at the toe where the face met the valley floor. And I saw something. At the toe of the embankment, roughly below monitoring point 3, the frost pattern was wrong. This is the kind of thing you don't notice unless you're looking carefully, and unless you know what you're looking at. Frost forms on surfaces that have radiated their heat away into the cold air overnight, on ground that is warmer than the air because something below is warming it, or because it's wet. Frost is thinner or absent. The frost was thinner in a strip maybe 3 meters wide, running from the toe of the downstream face into the grass of the valley floor. The rest of the slope was uniformly hard white. That strip was not. I stood at the bottom of the slope and pointed my flashlight at the ground and crouched down and touched it. The grass was damp. The soil underneath, when I pressed my finger into it, was soft, wet. I stood up. There was no surface water visible, no obvious seep, no open flow, no discoloration. Just wet grass and a frost shadow in a place where the ground had no reason to be warmer or wetter than anywhere else on that slope. I took out my phone. No signal. Of course, no signal. I took photographs with the work camera. Then I stood up and looked at the strip of anomalous ground, and looked up the slope toward the embankment crest, and did the geometry in my head. The monitoring point. The pore pressure sensor cluster. The settlement marker, all of them above me in a vertical line, with this wet strip at the bottom. I walked back up to the control room. I did not vary my re-entry. I went inside and sat down and picked up the landline. It was 2:11 in the morning. I called the emergency engineering line, not the standard on-call number. The one on the laminated card behind the console that I had never used in 14 months. While it rang, I looked at the clock. At 2:18, before anyone picked up, The siren started. It ran for a long time. Long enough that I stood there holding the receiver and listening to both sounds at once. The ringing on the line and the siren outside, until a voice came on and said hello, and I took a breath and started talking. The person on the emergency line was a duty engineer I'd never spoken to. His name was Carrasco. He sounded alert in the way people get alert when their emergency line rings at 2 in the morning, not startled, just calibrated, like he'd trained himself out of sleep disorientation for exactly this kind of call. I told him what I'd found. I was deliberate. I gave him the location, the frost pattern, the soil condition, the correlated sensor data, the timeline. I did not mention the siren, not because I was hiding it, but because I was on the phone to an emergency engineer at 2 in the morning, and I needed him focused on the things he could act on. He asked good questions. He asked about the extent of the wet zone, whether I'd observed any turbidity in the water downstream, whether the drainage collection at the toe had shown any change in measured outflow. I hadn't checked the toe drain collector that night. It was a separate structure about 40 meters east of where I'd been standing, a concrete sump with a float gauge, and he asked me to go check it while he stayed on the line. I went. The siren had stopped by then. I carried the phone handset as far as the cord allowed, and then set it on the console and went out with the work camera. The collector sump had a clear plastic sight tube on the outside of the box, same principle as a rain gauge, calibrated in liters per hour. Normal overnight readings in winter ran between 8 and 14 liters per hour. Groundwater drainage mostly, seasonal and predictable. The sight tube read 31. I went back and told Carrasco. He asked me to read it again. I told him I'd photographed it. Okay, he said. And then there was a pause that I understood immediately as him making a decision. I'm going to make some calls. I need you to continue monitoring and document everything. Don't adjust gate positions without talking to me first. What's your current reservoir elevation relative to spillway crest? I checked. 2.3 meters below. Good. Keep watching that number. If it moves more than 5 centimeters in either direction in the next hour, call me immediately. He hung up. I sat at the console and watched the reservoir elevation and the pore pressure readings and the toe drain collector reading, which I now had pulled up on the SCADA screen in real time. It ticked upward to 33 while I watched. Carrasco called back 40 minutes later and told me a field team was being mobilized. 2 geotechnical engineers and a dam safety inspector from the state program. Earliest they'd be on site was 5 a.m. The state program, I said. I contacted them as a precaution. Given the sensor correlation and the drain output, this warrants their presence. He paused. You did the right thing calling the emergency line. I didn't say anything. The routine reporting process, he said, and then stopped. Started again. The escalation should have happened sooner. I've seen your filed reports. I'm looking at them now. What happens at 5 a.m.? They'll do a visual survey of the downstream face and toe area, collect soil samples from the wet zone if they can access it safely, and make a determination about next steps. Depending on what they find, there may be a precautionary drawdown. Drawdown meant lowering the reservoir, reducing the hydraulic head against the embankment, taking pressure off whatever was happening inside the structure. What about the community downstream? I said. Notification protocol would engage if we move to a precautionary action classification. That's not a determination I can make unilaterally. The state inspector has that authority. I understood what he was saying. No siren. Not yet. Not from him. Not from the authority. That was someone else's call, and that someone wasn't on site. I looked at the siren control panel. Status indicator off. I'll keep watching the elevation, I said. The next 2 hours were the longest of my life, and also, strangely, some of the clearest. I was very focused. I logged readings every 15 minutes instead of every 2 hours. I watched the tow drain output climb to 37 and then hold. The reservoir elevation didn't move. The pore pressure sensors held their numbers. Nothing crossed a threshold. Nothing triggered an alarm. The siren did not sound again. At 4:40 a.m., headlights came down the access road. I went outside and met them. 2 trucks, 4 people, Carrasco among them, though I hadn't known he was coming. He was younger than I'd imagined from his voice. The state inspector was a woman in her 50s named Hartwell, who shook my hand and asked me to show her the tow zone before we did anything else. I walked them down in the pre-dawn dark with flashlights. The frost was less dramatic now. Temperature had risen slightly with the approaching dawn, but the wet zone was still visible if you knew what you were looking for, and Hartwell knew what she was looking for. She crouched at the toe and pressed her fingers into the soil the same way I had. And when she stood up, her expression was the professional version of what I'd felt when I'd done it. One of the geotechs started collecting samples. The other was photographing the area. Carrasco was on his phone, standing apart from the group, speaking quietly. Hartwell walked back up to me. "How long have you been monitoring the settlement trend at Point 3? "Since I identified the trend pattern, about 3 months. "And the pore pressure correlation?" "I included it in my second formal report, about 6 weeks ago." She looked at me steadily. "The response to your reports indicated scheduled assessment in 4 months. "Yes." She nodded once, the way someone nods when they're filing something internally rather than responding to it. "I'm going to need your personal observation log, not the official log. I understand operators sometimes keep secondary notes." I looked at her. "How did you know I had a secondary log?" "Pete Callahan kept one too," she said. "He gave it to us when we finally got him to talk." I stood very still. The dawn was coming up gray and cold over the eastern ridge, and the reservoir behind us was the color of pewter, and I said, "Pete left voluntarily. That's what Galloway told me." Pete Callahan left because he filed repeated escalating reports about this site over a period of 6 months and was told the situation was within threshold and under review. And then one morning he came off his shift and drove directly to the state dam safety office in person and sat in the lobby until someone would see him. She said it evenly, not dramatically, like a case file being read aloud. We conducted a preliminary review at that time. The sensor data he presented was concerning, but borderline. The formal inspection found no surface evidence of a problem. Without surface evidence or a clear threshold breach, we could not compel action. So nothing happened. We increased monitoring frequency, required monthly sensor reviews. The authority complied. The trends at that time were slower than what you're showing now. She paused. He left the site 2 weeks after that. I think he couldn't do the shift anymore, knowing what he knew and watching it move the way it was moving. I thought about the mug on the shelf behind the console. Pete's mug hands off. I thought about the note in the conduit box. 2 words written on electrical tape, left for whoever came next. Not for an engineer or an inspector, for the person doing the overnight shift. For the person who would be standing at that pole in the dark. Did he write the note in the conduit box? Something shifted slightly in her expression. What note? I described it. She asked to see the photograph, and I pulled it up on the work camera, and she looked at it for a long moment. "He didn't mention a note to us," she said. "But yes, that's his handwriting." We stood there for a moment with that between us. "He knew," I said. "He suspected. There's a difference, and it's an important one in terms of what we can act on." She handed the camera back. "He didn't know about the siren." That landed strangely. I reported the siren to Galloway multiple times. The reports I reviewed didn't include it. The formal written reports you filed through the authority's safety portal, there's no mention of the siren. I'd included the siren in my initial verbal reports to Galloway and the on-call engineers. I had not included it in the formal written reports. I'd made a decision somewhere along the way, I couldn't locate exactly when, that the siren anomaly would undermine the credibility of the sensor data concerns. That if I wrote also, the emergency siren sounds by itself when I'm not paying attention, the reasonable engineers reading the report would give more weight to that detail than to the pore pressure curves. So I'd left it out. I'd been strategic about it, and I'd told myself I was being professional. The siren has sounded 6 times during my tenure, I said. The pattern is consistent. It doesn't register in the SCADA event log or on the panel indicator. It sounds after I return from structural walks, but only when my attention is shifted. The interval varies based on whether I'm actively monitoring or not. She didn't say anything for a moment, meaning it sounds when you're not watching for it. Yes. She looked out at the reservoir. The light was coming up, and the water was less gray now, more blue-black. The siren system here is an older installation, 1980s. It's not fully integrated with the current SCADA. The connection is a retrofit, and the panel indicator and the event log both pull from the retrofit interface rather than directly from the siren circuit. She said this carefully. If the original circuit were activating independently of the retrofit interface, the SCADA wouldn't see it, and neither would the panel. What would activate the original circuit independently? Theoretically, a sustained change in pore pressure at the sensor cluster connected to the original installation. She paused. The original system had an analog trigger, pressure-based. It was supposed to be decommissioned when the SCADA was installed, but the retrofit documentation suggests it was left in place as a redundancy. Nobody has serviced the analog trigger in at least 15 years. I worked through that. The pore pressure in the embankment has been rising at 0.3 for 3 months. If the analog trigger is still connected and still functional, and if the pressure has been approaching its threshold level, the threshold is set conservatively. It would trigger well before any surface evidence appeared. She looked at me. It triggered before our instruments flagged a clear concern, before your formal reports generated a response. It triggered when the pressure crossed a level that someone, in 1987, decided was worth waking the valley up about. The siren had been right, all 6 times. Not a malfunction, not a ghost. A 37-year-old analog safety trigger responding to a real and developing condition, doing exactly what it was designed to do, activating exactly when the pressure warranted it, and being ignored by the SCADA, by the panel indicator, by every digital layer the modern system had placed between the original instrument and the people responsible for the dam for months. And it had been ignored by me too, in the formal reports. I had made it smaller than it was because I was afraid of how it sounded. I sat down on the cold slope without meaning to, not dramatically. My legs just found the ground. The 7 minutes, I said, the gap between when I came inside and when it sounded. When you came inside, you were moving around, logging in. The building was active. The analog trigger's activation threshold is sensitive to pressure vibration, mechanical interference from the building systems. The SCADA hardware, even footfall, could mask it. When you settled and went quiet, the interference dropped below the masking threshold, and the trigger completed its activation cycle. It waited for the building to go quiet, not for my attention to lapse, for the background noise to settle so the signal could get through. I had been building a theory about attention and vigilance and something watching for an unguarded moment. The actual explanation was a pressure sensor waiting for the vibration level to drop enough to close its circuit. It was more mundane than what I'd imagined, and somehow more frightening for being mundane. The instrument had been doing its job the whole time. The failure was everything layered on top of it. Carrasco came back up the slope toward us. He spoke to Hartwell quietly, turned his back to me in a way that wasn't quite deliberate. I heard the words initiate precautionary drawdown and notification and 72-hour window. And then they both turned back, and Carrasco said they were beginning drawdown procedures and asked me to walk him through the gate controls. I stood up. What about the community downstream? Notification is going out now, Hartwell said. Not an evacuation order, a precautionary advisory. The siren, I said. The actual siren. The physical one on the pole. The one people 4 miles down the road can hear. Is someone going to sound it? They looked at each other. Hartwell said, the precautionary classification doesn't meet the threshold for siren activation under current protocol. The analog trigger has been meeting its own threshold for 3 months. The analog trigger doesn't operate under current protocol. I looked at her. She looked back at me, and her expression said something her words weren't saying, which was that she agreed with me, and the protocol was the protocol, and she was working within it. I went back inside and walked Carrasco through the gate controls, and we began the drawdown. The mathematics of it were straightforward, how fast you could lower the reservoir without creating a different set of problems, how you managed the discharge, what you watched for as the head reduced. I focused on that, the concrete tasks, the numbers. At some point in the middle of it, my phone buzzed. I'd driven up the access road at midnight to call Nora. This was a Thursday, our scheduled night, and she'd been in a good mood, chatty, telling me about a movie she'd seen. The buzz was a message from her mother. Just checking you're okay. Saw there might be some activity at the reservoir on the local news. Local news. 40 minutes away, and they'd already picked it up. I wrote back, all fine, working through it, talk tomorrow. Nora didn't know. As far as she knew, it was an ordinary shift, and I was doing ordinary things. I sat at the console, monitoring the drawdown, while the geotechs worked outside, and the sky went full light, and the day shift operator arrived at 6, and looked at the room full of people with an expression I recognized as the expression of someone who is about to have a very long day explained to them. I stayed. Nobody asked me to, and nobody asked me to leave. I stayed because the gate operations were mid-sequence, and I knew the system, and because I wasn't sure I could make myself drive away. At 8:15 a.m., one of the geotechs came in and spoke to Hartwell in a low voice, and Hartwell stood up straighter and said they'd found something. She didn't tell me immediately. She went outside, and I watched through the window as the 4 of them stood together below the building, and I saw the geotech point toward the tow zone, and I saw Hartwell take out her phone and make a call. She came back inside 5 minutes later. There's a seep opening at the toe, she said. The sample bore confirmed internal migration. It's early stage, but it's active. Early stage. Active. The embankment was losing material. Slowly, through a pathway that had been developing for how long? Before Pete. Before whoever worked here before Pete. The pore pressure record only went back to the SCADA installation. The settlement monitoring only went back to the original construction survey. Nobody knew when it had started, or how long the analog trigger had been picking up the signal and sending it out into the dark valley, while the digital systems logged nothing and the authority scheduled assessments 4 months out. Hartwell was looking at me. We're moving to a precautionary action classification. Drawdown continues. I'm recommending evacuation of the downstream zone as a precautionary measure. The siren? I said. She picked up the landline. I watched her dial. I watched her speak. I watched her hand the phone to Carrasco and walk to the siren control panel and enter an override sequence I'd never seen used and flip the manual activation switch. The siren started outside. The real activation. The one that logged in the SCADA and registered on the panel and meant what it was supposed to mean. Loud enough that I felt it in my chest. long, rising, then sustained, the way it was designed. I had heard that sound 6 times in the dark and alone, and each time I'd stood under that pole wondering what it was telling me. Now I knew, and the sound was the same, and the morning light was flat and gray, and I picked up my jacket and my notebook and my camera, and I thought about 4 miles of valley road and 60 houses, and people waking up to a sound they'd been told to take seriously. I drove out ahead of the evacuation traffic, not because I was told to leave. I left because there was nothing more I could do at the structure that the people there couldn't do better, and because standing in that control room while the siren ran felt like something I didn't have the right to anymore. I'd been the person in that room for 14 months. I'd heard the signal 6 times and reported it selectively, and filed my formal concerns through the correct channels and waited for the correct channels to respond. Now, other people were doing the work that came after all of that, and my presence wasn't helping anything. It was just a thing I was doing to feel less useless. So I drove out. The access road came down out of the valley and joined the county route heading south, and about 2 miles down I pulled over, because there were already 2 official vehicles coming the other way. Emergency management, I think, or county sheriff, and I had to half-mount the shoulder to let them pass. I sat there with the engine running and watched them go, and then sat there a while longer. The valley stretched out to my left. You couldn't see the dam from there. You couldn't see the reservoir. Just the tree line and the gray January sky, and the road bending away toward the community 4 miles down. And somewhere ahead of me on that road, people were waking up to the siren and doing what the county emergency plan said to do, which was get in their cars and go to the high school gymnasium 2 towns over and wait for official word. Most of them had probably never heard the siren for real before. Most of them had probably heard it tested once a year and thought of it as a background feature of living near a dam. One of those things you acclimate to, file away, stop thinking about. I wondered if any of them had ever lain awake listening for it. If any of them had, at any point in the years, the analog trigger had been quietly crossing its threshold in the dark. Heard it. I drove the 40 minutes home. The apartment felt wrong in the way that all ordinary spaces feel wrong after something extraordinary, which is to say it felt too small and too quiet and aggressively normal. I sat on the edge of the bed without taking off my jacket and looked at the floor for a while. I wasn't sure how long. I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table and wrote up a complete personal account while everything was still clear, everything I'd observed, every date I could confirm against the log, the conduit box note, the conversations with Galloway, all of it. Not for any formal purpose, just because I needed it outside of my head and on paper, ordered and complete, before memory started doing what memory does. My father called around noon. He'd seen it on the regional news by then. Precautionary evacuation, dam safety assessment, no immediate danger to the downstream community. The story was being handled carefully, which probably meant the authorities' communications team was working hard to keep the framing measured. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes." "Did they find something?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Early stage, like you thought?" "Early stage, active." Another pause. "You caught it early enough." I didn't answer right away. The thing about early enough is that it contains within it the question of how much later would have been too late. And I didn't know the answer to that, and the geotext didn't know the answer to that, and probably nobody would ever know the precise answer, because the scenario you prevented doesn't leave evidence of what it would have been. "Pete caught it too," I said, "before me. He filed reports and went to the state office in person, and they did a review and found nothing conclusive, and he left, And then the site ran on rotating coverage for 8 or 9 months, and then I started. And the trend continued during those 8 or 9 months. Yes. Slower, apparently. But yes. My father didn't say anything to that. He understood what it meant without me having to say it, which was that the process had had multiple opportunities and had not moved fast enough at any of them. Not through malice. Through the same mechanism that makes every institutional slow-motion failure possible. Thresholds and review windows, and the difficulty of acting urgently on something that is, at every individual measurement, within bounds. The siren, I said, and then I told him about the analog trigger, about the retrofit, the decommissioned threshold, the vibration masking. He listened without interrupting, which was how he listened when he was thinking seriously. 1980s installation, he said when I finished. That's what Hartwell said. That generation of dam safety equipment was built around the idea that the instruments needed to be harder to ignore than the engineers. He said it simply, not as a criticism of anyone in particular. The assumption was that digital integration would improve things. Better data, better logging, better communication, and it did improve things. But when you layer enough interface over an analog signal, sometimes the signal stops being the thing anyone is looking at. I thought about that, about the siren sounding in the dark and registering nowhere, about how thoroughly a thing can be present and simultaneously invisible, depending on where the monitoring layer sits. I left it out of the formal reports, I said. The siren. I thought it would make the rest of the data harder to take seriously. Did you tell Galloway verbally? Every time. Then you reported it, he said. What he did with it is on him. That was probably true in a strict sense. It didn't sit as cleanly as he meant it to. Nora called that Thursday, our regular night. I was in the truck at the side of the access road out of habit, though the site was still active with the assessment team, and I hadn't been back to the structure since that morning. I hadn't been told not to go back. I just hadn't. She'd seen something about it too, apparently. Her mother had mentioned it at dinner. She asked me if it was my dam. Yes, I said. Is it okay? They're working on it. It'll be okay. Were you scared? I looked out through the windshield at the dark tree line. Cold night, clear, stars beginning to show. A little. More worried than scared. What's the difference? I thought about how to answer that for someone who was 8. Scared is about what's happening to you. Worried is about what might happen to other people. She considered that. I think I was a little worried, she said, when Mom told me. The thing that happened when she said that was not something I'm going to try to describe fully. I'll just say that the whole weight of the last 14 months arrived at once in a way that I wasn't prepared for. The night drives, the notebook, the siren counting up, the frost pattern on the slope at 3 in the morning, and the wet soil under my fingers, and the tow drain reading 37 and climbing. All of it had felt, while I was inside it, like a professional problem. A technical problem with an emotional undertow. And what she'd said, I was a little worried, put a different frame around the whole thing, because she lived 4 miles downstream, in a different direction, and hadn't been in any physical danger. But she had sat at a dinner table and heard the word, damn, and thought about me, and then called me on our scheduled night to ask if I was scared. She had been doing what I'd been doing, watching from the available distance, trying to determine if something was wrong. I'm fine, I said. The people who are supposed to fix it are fixing it. That's how it's supposed to work. Did the siren go off? At the end, yes. Was it loud? Very loud. She made the sound she made when something confirmed what she'd expected. Good, she said, in the particular way that 8-year-olds say good when they've decided the situation is resolved. and then she moved on to something else, and I let her move me along with her. I sat in the truck for a while after the call ended. The access road was dark and empty ahead of me. The site was about 1.5 miles further in, and I could see a faint glow where the work lights had been set up along the downstream face. I didn't drive in. I drove home. I no longer work at the site. I resigned 6 weeks after the incident, which was about 3 weeks after the preliminary investigation confirmed active internal erosion along the drainage path between the clay core and the filter zone at monitoring point 3. The finding was consistent with what Pete had flagged, consistent with what the analog trigger had been registering, and consistent with what my formal reports had described. The state dam safety program issued findings. The authorities' response protocols were reviewed. Galloway retired sometime in the following months. That might be related. I genuinely don't know. The structure itself underwent emergency remediation. Grouting, filter repairs, extended drawdown, close monitoring. The downstream community was out for about 11 days before being allowed to return. No one was hurt. The embankment held. I want to be honest about why I left the job, rather than being straightforwardly proud of anything. The easy version of this story is that I caught something. I persisted, I escalated, and the system eventually worked. And that version isn't wrong, exactly. But it's incomplete. The siren had been sounding since before I arrived. Pete had found it first and had done everything right, and had been unable to move the institution, and had eventually walked away. The analog trigger had been generating a real signal throughout both of our tenures, and the signal had been absorbed and neutralized by every digital layer between it and the people authorized to act. I had heard the signal 6 times and had consciously chosen to exclude it from the formal record because I was worried about credibility. That choice didn't end in disaster, but it could have. If the frost pattern had taken another season to reach the surface, if the tow drain had stayed within a range that looked like seasonal variation for another few months, I would have been sitting in that control room, monitoring a trend I'd reported, and watching it approach the threshold that someone would eventually have to call serious enough. With the analog trigger sounding into the dark every few weeks and logging nowhere, I don't think I'm a cautionary tale, but I'm not a clean success story either. The thing I think about most now is the question of what the siren was doing in the months before I noticed it. In the rotating coverage period, in however long it had been sounding before Pete started his personal log. There would have been someone in that control room at 2 a.m. on those nights, sitting at the console, doing their readings. And the siren would have run for 6 or 8 or 10 seconds in the dark, and they would have checked the panel indicator, and it would have shown off, and they would have written it up or not written it up, and moved on with their shift. How many times had it sounded, in total, before anyone understood what it was? I don't know. There's no log for it. That's the nature of an analog signal that every digital system is ignoring. It happened and it went away. And the next shift began, and the water pressed against the earth in the dark, and the instrument registered its concern and sent it out into the valley, and waited for someone to put together what it meant. Hartwell called me once, about 2 months after I resigned. Professional call, just a few questions about the timeline and my log documentation, which I'd handed over completely. At the end, she paused in a way that felt like something other than a procedural pause, and said she wanted me to know that the finding had resulted in a formal review of analog safety systems at 11 other impoundments in the state. She said 2 of them had legacy triggers in similar configurations. Not all of them were functional after years of neglect, but both were connected to sensor clusters, showing trends worth examining. I said I was glad to hear it. She said Pete Callahan was glad to hear it too. I called him before I called you. I hadn't known she was in contact with Pete. How is he? Fine. working for a county public works department somewhere west of here. He seemed... She paused, looking for the word. Relieved that something had come of it. After the call, I sat at the kitchen table and thought about Pete for a while. A person I'd never met and would probably never meet, who had sat in the same room I'd sat in, heard the same sound, made notes in his own notebook, pushed the same institution in the same directions, and then reached a point where he couldn't keep doing the shift anymore, and left. And on the way out, standing at the siren pole at some hour of the night, had opened the conduit box and written 2 words on a piece of electrical tape. Not for the engineers, not for the authority, for the next person who would be alone out there and starting to wonder. Check 3. It's a small thing to leave someone, but it's what he had. It's what the situation allowed. You do what the situation allows, and you hope that what you put into the chain is enough to move something forward. And sometimes you don't get to know whether it was. He knew now. I hope it was worth something. I video call Nora on Tuesdays and Thursdays still, same as before. I have a different job, closer to the city, less isolation. I see her in person more often, which is something I didn't let myself want too directly while I was doing the overnight shifts, because wanting it too directly would have made the 40-minute drive and the 9-hour stretches without signal harder to manage. She asked me once, a few weeks after everything, what I would have done differently. I thought about it seriously before answering, because she deserved a real answer. I would have trusted the thing I heard, I said. Earlier, I would have written it down exactly as it was, instead of shaping it into something I thought people would believe. She considered that with the particular focus she brought to things she was actually thinking about. Why didn't you? Because it sounded strange, and I didn't want the strange part to get in the way of the part that mattered. But the strange part was the part that mattered. Yes, I said, it was. She nodded like that confirmed something and moved on. 8 years old. She filed it away the way she filed things, efficiently and completely, and I have no idea what she'll do with it eventually. The analog trigger at Hayward was decommissioned properly after the remediation. Not disconnected and forgotten, decommissioned. Documented, removed, logged. Hartwell made sure of that. The new installation integrates fully with the SCADA and the panel and every other layer of the system. And if it ever reaches its threshold, it will register everywhere simultaneously, and nobody will have to stand under a pole in the dark, trying to figure out what they heard. That's better. That's unambiguously better. But sometimes, on clear nights, I think about the valley below that slope, the 60 houses, the road running south in the dark, and I think about a pressure sensor from 1987 doing the only thing it knew how to do, sending its signal out into the air, because that was what it had been built for, asking to be heard by anyone who was listening. It asked for a long time before anyone answered,